esteemed colleague now from the University of Aberystwyth, Christian Enemark, who's going to be talking about germs and public health and biodefense priorities.
And that sort of thing. Thanks very much, and thank you very much, John Herington, for inviting me to join this really excellent workshop. Papers so far have been just outstanding, interdisciplinary, but I nevertheless feel very much at home, not at all isolated. I am in constant awe and admiration of the painstaking logic of philosophers, and I always come away feeling duly disciplined, having sat through these meticulous processes of reasoning that philosophers engage in. And I admire the way that many philosophers can just turn their minds to just about anything and talk us through salient issues. There will be no such painstaking logical application here. I'm going to be a little more fast and loose. I'm from the discipline of international relations, and I'm particularly concerned with seeing some policy change in the area of public health and biodefense priorities, and I may come across as being in a little bit of a hurry because of that. So I'm going to focus on the political and popular concern about disease outbreaks that are caused by bioterrorism, and in particular on the American government's devotion of attention and resources to biodefense against bioterrorism. And I deal with the policy dilemma that arises in this context, the vexing predicament, the question, how do you achieve protection against biological attacks without unduly distorting funding priorities and thus neglecting other serious health challenges? So I'd like to address the claim that is out there, especially amongst many public health practitioners and scholars, the claim that the US government worries too much about bioterrorism, too little about other infectious disease risks, and that it spends too much money on biodefense, too little on public health generally. And that claim really expresses an ethical concern about utility. And it occasions some consideration of evidence and uncertainty as bases for policymaking. And when national security goals and public health goals are being pursued in concert, as it were, we find that there's a tension between, on the one hand, the goal of protecting against future and uncertain threats, hypothetical biological attacks, and on the other hand, the goal of reducing present and measurable risks, so ongoing morbidity and mortality, illness and death. And before I get into a discussion, I'd like to begin with a story. And the story begins in May of 1980, when the World Health Assembly met in Geneva, and at that meeting, the disease smallpox was officially declared eradicated from nature. Now, the virus that causes smallpox lives on in two secure laboratories, one in the United States, one in Russia, formerly the Soviet Union. But as of that official announcement, the disease itself no longer presents a health risk to anyone, anywhere. As such, and following that announcement, there was no longer any need for people to be vaccinated against smallpox. But in late 2001, the US government settled on a different view of smallpox disease and smallpox vaccination. And this change to a different view occurred not in response to a reported case of smallpox infection, but rather to the deaths of 5 Americans from a very different infectious disease, anthrax. So that disease is caused by a bacterium. It's non-contagious, unlike smallpox. But what mattered most to the US government was the fact that these deadly cases of anthrax had been deliberately caused. So there were letters sent And those letters contained, in addition to a little note saying that you were under attack, bacteria, anthrax bacteria. While reading your note, you would inhale a faceful of bacteria and you were infected. And if you were unlucky, you become ill and die of the disease called anthrax. So this then raised concerns, or raised them further, about future bioterrorist use of pathogenic microorganisms in general. And one of the people engaged by the US government to consider what are we going to do now was the champion of global smallpox disease eradication, an American called D.A. Henderson. So he led the global campaign to eradicate smallpox from nature, and he recalls some of the considerations in the US government late in 2001 after the anthrax attacks. And he says, and I'll quote, "Emergency meetings were convened as we pondered threats and decided what should be given highest priority. There was no question but that smallpox virus as a biological weapon posed the most serious threat to the country. No other microbial agent was a contender. It was one of the most lethal of possible agents, killing 30% of its victims, and there was no available therapy." Now, as of that time, the US National Pharmaceutical Stockpile, which was later renamed the Strategic National Stockpile, held only 15 million doses of smallpox vaccine. Now, that's significant that there were that many already. That already prior to the anthrax attacks, the US government was worried about the possible deliberate release of the virus that causes smallpox, because of course there was no longer any natural risk in existence. But after the anthrax attacks, the US government then quickly took steps to acquire enough smallpox vaccine to vaccinate every US citizen. So around 300 million doses. And the following year, 2002, the government started planning on how to use those vaccines, how many to use, in preparation for a smallpox bioterrorism event. So there was one proposal that every American should be vaccinated. That proposal was rejected. But in late 2002, the US government then announced an unprecedented campaign of pre-event mass smallpox vaccinations to be carried out in 2 phases. The first phase would involve vaccinating 500,000 military personnel and 500,000 health workers. The second phase was to involve 10 million emergency response personnel, police, firefighters, ambulance officers, and the like. The 500,000 military personnel went along with this quite well, as perhaps military personnel want to do, and military personnel, especially if they were deploying to Iraq, after 2003, they would have received anthrax vaccine. This was part of their own security experience. Not so much with the 500,000 health workers, and certainly this initiative never got to the 10 million emergency response personnel, and I'll tell you a bit of why that's the case. And this, as this story goes on, you might detect that there is perhaps a moral to this story. So, 500,000 US health workers to be vaccinated against smallpox. Now, this was an exercise in biodefense against bioterrorism, and it was a vaccination campaign that promised both health and security benefits. Vaccination would provide lasting protection, what we might call immunity, from infection to those individuals who would play a critical response role in the event of a real biological attack involving smallpox. And another benefit claimed was that the chances of there being a smallpox attack would be reduced if a would-be bioterrorist calculated that the damage he or she caused would be less. Everyone's vaccinated, or at least critical people are vaccinated against this disease. I'm not going to bother. So, following its eradication from nature, the smallpox virus was not going to be obtained by a bioterrorist from a natural source. So this threat narrative was necessarily premised on this danger of stocks of the virus having been retained in these secure laboratories being stolen. Now, or an alternative possibility was that there were stocks outside of these 2 official repositories of the virus, perhaps deliberately kept outside, or we just had inadvertently not collected up all the outstanding smallpox stocks in the world in various laboratories. So those stocks, if they existed, if they might be stolen in the future, or if they were in the bottom of some freezer somewhere, if those viruses could be used in a biological attack, no one really knew what the risk of that was. It was an unknowable risk. And that risk was readily perceived as low or non-existent. The unknowability was kind of equated with a low or non-existent risk. Now, George W. Bush, when he announced this program himself, said, look, quote, these vaccinations are a precaution only and not a response to any information concerning imminent danger. Certainly there was no imminent danger of natural exposure to smallpox virus. And yet, real risks accompanied vaccination itself. So this is the real risk for a would-be recipient of smallpox vaccine. Vaccination involves exposing individuals to live virus, a vaccinia virus, which is very closely related to variola major, which causes smallpox. But there is a high rate of complications arising from that vaccination process, and in 2002, one senior official described smallpox vaccine as probably the least safe vaccine. So, in the absence of a natural risk of smallpox infection, and in light of uncertainty about the bioterrorism risk, a given individual, health worker, could have perceived the risk of vaccination, complications from it, as outweighing the risk of remaining unvaccinated and thus vulnerable to a potential smallpox attack. And they might have calculated that the risk of being killed in a smallpox bioterrorist attack was lower than the risk of dying from complications of receiving the vaccination. So those of you who are old enough would know that there's little pinpricks in the top of your arm, and you can see some photographs of some really horrific reactions by some recipients. Now, that's in terms of thinking about the individual risk of taking a vaccine to protect against a disease that is non-existent, but also protected against a virus that might be released. But then there was another concern. Remember, these are health workers, not just concerned for their own bodies, but concerned for the things that they do in society. And the concern was that this large-scale smallpox vaccination campaign came at a cost of interrupting the everyday activities of state and local health systems in the United States. And there were complaints as the campaign unrolled. Public health officials complained that in order to meet these vaccination requirements, they had to be scaling back, deferring other important work such as tuberculosis screening, childhood vaccinations. These they regarded as opportunity costs. Combine those with the personal cost potentially of undergoing vaccination, and ultimately a great many US health workers rejected the option to undergo smallpox vaccination. In fact, 92% of the 500,000 health workers that were intended to receive the vaccination rejected that option. It was a colossal failure. I don't think that is an exaggeration. It was expensive not only in terms of lost opportunity, but because there were 145 adverse reactions, including 3 deaths to vaccinations, the government then had to compensate the victims, and that added to the financial cost of this campaign. And as it started to emerge that so few health workers were getting on board with this, supporters of the campaign criticised those health workers who questioned it, who rejected it, and their argument was, one such argument was, and I quote, there are moral and medical reasons to deplore the decisions of physicians and hospital officials who opt out. Their job is not to assess intelligence risks or second-guess public health officials. Well, it might not be their job, but that is exactly what 92% of health workers did. And it happened because there was this fundamental disharmony of emphasis as between national security and public health perspectives regarding the benefits and costs of vaccination against an eradicated disease, or what I might call a non-existent disease. So, in this particular example of a biodefense activity, real risks and measurable costs were seen clearly to outweigh uncertain threats and potential benefits. And I'm trying to be careful in deliberately using and differentiating between risks and threats. And maybe you might want to probe me on that later on. The episode is, for me, a lesson in the need to weigh carefully the benefits of a particular response to bioterrorism against the costs. And this is a lesson applicable to biodefense activities that are presently ongoing. And my policy concern is that it concerns me that so much time, effort, and lost opportunity is there in respect of a non-existent disease. Vaccination against smallpox is an example of a biodefense activity that has only a single benefit. The single benefit of protecting against a potential deliberately caused outbreak. I would like to see all biodefense activities yielding a dual benefit. A requirement that all biodefense activities always should be of a kind that protects not only against biological attacks but also against naturally occurring infectious disease risks. Now, in arriving at that view, I gave some consideration to some of the most vocal critics of biodefense spending in the United States, critics who we would probably describe as objective utilitarians, people who obsess over evidence. I don't necessarily say that as a criticism. I think having a regard for evidence is a very sound way to approach a policy problem. But objective utilitarians will insist on setting policy according to some kind of index of rationally knowable components of well-being. So they will look at health statistics, they will concern themselves with illness and death rates, they might concern themselves with disability-adjusted life years lost, DALYs. They might even concern themselves, as John did, with health-adjusted life expectancy and all sorts of different indices. And there's this richness of data that you can just wallow in and then emerge dripping in the data and then prescribe policy. The evidence points to the way we should be going. Now, objective utilitarians are often appalled by the way in which ordinary non-expert folk overestimate risk, and in particular overestimate newly discovered risks. And I guess in the case of bioterrorism in the United States, we might call this a newly rediscovered risk, because for the United States government at least, biological weapons was nothing new. They in fact probably had the world's biggest biological warfare program up until 1969, but it's a newly rediscovered risk. And the concern has been that there is an overestimation by government and the American population of the bioterrorism risk attaching to particular microorganisms, and that thus too much money is being spent on finding ways to defend against those microorganisms, money which, the evidence tells us, they might say, is better spent where the most life-saving could occur. Spend it on the big killers. So I was somehow tempted to get some PowerPoint slides together, and the first one is illegible. I generally only put this up for shock value. A long list of the organisms that the United States government is concerned about, organisms of bioterrorism concern. At its height, there were about 82 organisms on the list. I think it currently is sitting at around 50-something. And you'll see that it's divided into those which are the concern of the Department of Health and Human Services, as being organisms that infect, cause disease in humans, US Department of Agriculture, animal diseases, and these overlap. Both animals and humans are infected. For example, Nipah virus, Hendra virus, suburb of Brisbane in Australia. Bacillus anthracis, which causes anthrax, and a few other likely prospects over here. Botulinum neurotoxins in tiny quantities. It's for cosmetic purposes as Botox. What else have we got? Ebola virus, Marburg, SARS, variola major, which causes smallpox, Yersinia pestis, which causes plague. And if they're on this list, then they attract various rules and regulations in terms of how they can be safely handled and transported, disposed of. But also, if they're on this list, they might be attracting special funding. Because these are the organisms of bioterrorism concern, these are the organisms that the United States government most wants to be able to defend against, especially using medical countermeasures. And there's a tiny illegible asterisk down here that says denotes a tier 1 agent. There's a list within a list. These are the agents of bioterrorism concern, and then there are the tier 1 agents of bioterrorism really extreme concern. So these are the really big bad biological agents in a somewhat more legible slide. And you'll see here from this list that there are 12 diseases mentioned, because botulism is mentioned twice. And of these, 2 are animal diseases, so you'll see there. And so that leaves us with 9 of the remaining presenting a natural risk, because smallpox has been eradicated. And then I'd like to show you a little bit of a comparison for how some of these turn up in a sample year in the United States in terms of diseases being not only of bioterrorism concern, but notifiable. Notifiable diseases is a term you may be familiar with for public health purposes. So I've mentioned them down the bottom here, and this is not a full list of all the diseases that were notifiable in 2011, it's the most recent data. But you'll see that they feature, these are tier 1 agents here, and the numbers are not high. None of the cases were fatal, at least in that particular year. And in terms of the number of reported cases, you're getting into these huge numbers of sexually transmitted illnesses. And that's but probably looking at a great deal more morbidity, at least, in respect of these particular infectious disease risks. And that's just one way, it's certainly not the only way, in which objective utilitarians coming from a public health perspective will say, well, good heavens, from one year to the next, anthrax is really not a big problem. Why are we spending so much money on defending against that particular disease? And so the complaint has arisen, and it's been arising ever since the biodefense expansion after the anthrax attacks. Focus on the real killers. Focus on the things that cause the greatest morbidity. Focus on the things that cause the greatest mortality. Don't just focus on the new, sexy, high-profile, much-talked-about threats to public health. And this has happened before, not just in respect of biodefense, but the complaint was made about HIV/AIDS in the 1990s. The National Institutes of Health in the US was spending all this money promoting research, disease-specific research on HIV/AIDS. In fact, at one stage, it was spending more than a quarter of its research budget sponsoring work on HIV/AIDS, and yet only 17% on promoting research on heart disease. And it was cause for complaint in some quarters that, come on, heart disease kills more people, therefore there should be more funding for heart disease than for HIV/AIDS. And they had figures, and they threw the figures at the government. And as I say, biodefense has attracted the same criticism. So one example of this from 2005, Larry Gostin, known to some of us. Larry Gostin argued in 2005, quote, biodefense unfavourably shifts the public health agenda to low probability events and funds the wrong activities. In 2010, Harley Feldbaum and Joshua Michaud wrote, quote, the many billions of dollars invested after 2001 in biodefense by wealthy countries is attributable to the perceived national security threat of a bioterrorist attack, despite bioterrorism causing only a small number of deaths to date compared to deaths from naturally occurring diseases. So they might show us another table across time showing how few people have been killed in biological attacks. And so the argument tends to be, look, if you, rather than considering this bioterrorism problem in isolation, it should be considered alongside infectious disease risks, just so that we can see just how small the problem is, and so that we can accordingly reduce drastically the amount of money and effort that we spend addressing this problem. Of course, the interesting thing about this kind of argument is that there is a tendency to characterize bioterrorism as a risk of which the probability and likely consequences are very low. That's the tendency. So look, it's hardly ever happened in the past, therefore the risk is low. But they will, at the same time, make clear how little empirical evidence there is of biological attacks. There's so little empirical data to go on. There is arguably a dearth of data. So what they call a low risk is perhaps better characterized as an uncertain risk. And there are people who would say that uncertainty and risk are the same thing. Some will insist that risk is about probability, and I'm often quite nervous in using the term risk because it is used in different ways for different purposes. But I guess uncertain is a better way of describing the risk of bioterrorism rather than low. I think it's at least a safer way of talking about it. The difficulty with trying to beat governments over the head with evidence, as it were, is that governments are not only concerned with what has happened in the past, what is going on now, but governments are concerned, and perhaps should be concerned, with the things that might happen in the future. It's a duty, as it were. It's already a struggle because the arguments that they will receive from objective utilitarians using different kinds of evidence will be different. You will get the Dali-based argument to spend money in a certain way, the mortality statistics argument to spend money in a particular way. And in fact, a major criticism of the Dali indice, of course, is that it ignores personal and cultural variations in people's attitudes to pain, disability and death as different things. And in particular, people perhaps intuitively, in their non-expert fashion, tend to think that death is kind of more serious, and that perhaps mortality rates are more meaningful to them than Dali's. But of course the other thing is that, and governments I guess have to be sensitive to this, is that people fear not just death, but the manner in which they might die. Death is already quite an exotic destiny. No living person has ever experienced death before. I put that out there as a statement of fact rather than a provocation, although maybe some of the philosophers might pick that up. Not only is it this exotic destiny, but people really are concerned with not only whether they're going to die or the likelihood of it, but how they die. And I think I'm not pushing the boat out too far when I say that people generally want a good death. A neat, tidy, short, painless, quick death. Well, I speak for myself. And so people are sensitive to the way in which you die. And in a bioterrorist attack, if you've been deliberately infected with anthrax, you're getting these massive black lesions and swollen glands and brain swelling. It's not a good look. Ebola symptoms, also not a good look. And people will be perhaps concerned that it's not a good death. And then there will be this other element. Arguably, it feels worse, at least different, to be in this condition because someone did it to you, rather than because you were exposed to an organism through some natural infection process. So perhaps there is a tendency to privilege the prospect of an infectious disease-driven death that has been deliberately caused and which elicits quite horrific symptoms. And that kind of goes against the grain of the tables of mortality and morbidity statistics, saying, well, you're more likely to die of smoking than being killed in a terrorist attack. So, and off you go, and don't smoke. So I think governments have to be more sensitive to popular sensibilities than that, and I think they will be more sensitive. They have to be re-elected, and so I think it's a bit of a forlorn hope amongst objective utilitarians to just kind of beat governments over the head with statistics and expect the money to flow in the direction they would like. I think a more realistic expectation, and I think something to be aimed for, is that when it comes to biodefense, rather than try and just sort of rip a whole bunch of money out of biodefense because it's biodefense, and redirect it to other things, is just to require biodefense to provide a dual benefit. Okay, let's accept that it's okay that biodefense has the benefit of providing protection against a possible bioterrorist attack, but let us also require that a specific activity also protects against infectious disease risks more generally. Now, you would think that there is already a very, very strong overlap as between biodefense activities and those things that are required generally that are protective of public health. And so, yes, in large measure, there is dual benefit activity going on in biodefense. In fact, most of it, if you look at funding streams, is in fact dual benefit, but quite a large proportion is still single benefit. And I'd like to talk about two examples of biodefense activities where I see that there is either no dual benefit or insufficient dual benefit in respect of an overemphasis on protecting against bioterrorism. One area of biodefense activity that I'd like to talk about is a program called BioWatch. I don't have time to go into it now, but if you're curious, you can ask me about it. It is a biodefense activity which over the last decade has cost about $1 billion, which involves setting up environmental sensors in cities in various parts of the United States that essentially sniff the air every now and then on the off chance that someone has released an aerosol of an organism in the vicinity of that particular sensor. And in terms of my requirement for a dual benefit, I won't dwell on it because I think it's rather a slam dunk. It's so obviously a single benefit system. It's not the kind of system, for example, that is going to set off an alarm in case someone who is infected with the SARS virus happens to sneeze next to the environmental sensor. There's no sense in which someone who has been naturally infected with a virus is going to sort of notify the authorities because of this particular technology. It's just not designed to do that, not intended to do that. But the thing that I most prefer to get my teeth into when it comes to sort of wanting dual benefit is in respect to another major multi-billion-dollar biodefense activity, which is not BioWatch but BioShield. You love the names of these programs. And BioShield is this multi-billion-dollar incentive scheme that encourages private companies to conduct research on pathogens of bioterrorism concern. So the idea is that the research is conducted with a view to developing new pharmaceutical countermeasures, new vaccines, antibiotics, antitoxins, antiviral drugs. Large quantities thereof are then produced and sold to the United States government. It's this little special market that's been set up just between contractors under BioShield and the US government, which is the sole purchaser of these drugs. It's purchased on behalf of the American people and placed in the strategic national stockpile for a rainy day when there's a bioterrorist attack. So Project BioShield has been running for a decade now and has recently been extended for a further 5 years. And in my view, falls short considerably as regards satisfying the dual benefit test for biodefense activities. Oh, sorry, John, there is some animation in this. After 10 years, Project BioShield has produced new medical countermeasures for 3 diseases: botulism, smallpox, anthrax. George W. Bush specifically named Ebola virus and plague when he was launching BioShield. We're yet to have new treatments come out of the BioShield process for those diseases. Note also the particular diseases against which new countermeasures have been researched, developed, purchased, stockpiled: botulism, smallpox, and anthrax. Botulism is in fact caused by a toxin. It is not something that you can catch from someone. It's like being poisoned if you have botulism. Bacillus anthracis is not human-to-human transmissible.
So the extent of damage is self-limiting. How many people were initially exposed to the organism when it was sprayed or enveloped or whatever else? And of course that peculiar characteristic of variola major, which has been eradicated from nature, but which has nevertheless attracted more than $1 billion in funding to research and develop new drugs for defending against smallpox. Did I mention that smallpox is a non-existent disease? So let's take a bit of a closer look at some of the drugs that have come up here. Smallpox down the bottom here, Infamune, produced by Bavarian Nordic, which is a new kind of vaccine that is less likely to produce damaging side effects. So people who are immune compromised, young kids, people with HIV/AIDS are less likely to have an adverse reaction to smallpox vaccination. And an antiviral called Aberystwyth, formerly called ST246 by Biotechnologies, produced. And this number for Aberystwyth, since this table was published at the end of 2012, has then gone up to 2 million doses. And that figure has gone up to $463 million, and that's how I got to more than $1 billion being spent on defending against smallpox. In the case of Aberystwyth, the president of the company that made it, securitizing, and Aberystwyth basically came out at a cost of $200 a dose. The president of the company said that this drug is a bargain compared to the annual cost of $20,000 for AIDS antiretrovirals and compared to cancer drugs that annually cost more than $100,000. And the president of Securitizing went on to argue that because the US government purchased only 2 million doses, this was, quote, on the low end, unquote,